Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm down in Lewes today. I felt a need to get out of London. This is of course the home of Harvey's Sussex best bitter, Harvey's Brewery. Let's go and see what the pubs of Lewes have to offer. Pub number one, the Lewes Arms. Cheers from the Lewes Arms, one of my favourite pubs of all time. Harvey's Sussex best, of course. Don't be deceived by the Fuller's logo on this. It is today owned by Fuller's, but Harvey's is very much a fixture on the bar, and we'll actually talk about that a little bit later, about the previous controversy. Always particularly good, I think, here at the Lewes Arms. Good generally in Lewes, of course, the home of Harvey's, but particularly here. I was just talking to the chap behind the bar, possibly the manager. He puts it down to the quality of their cellars here. There's a lot of stone there, ancient cellars, possibly part of the foundations of the wider castle precinct. We should take a look at the exterior first. This is a listed building and it's also on camera's list of historic pub interiors. It's got this beautiful curved frontage to it in a sort of brown greyish brick, slate roof on top, and there is, I think, a particularly impressive piece of ironmongery, the bracket that holds up the pub sign. The main door has some etched glass in it, and there's also an unusual glazed door to the right hand side of the building that's incredibly narrow, and I don't know if that was perhaps just a staff entrance at one time or if that's always simply been a floor to ceiling window there. The building that we see today dates to the early 19th century, probably a rebuild of about 1823. So the front door has the Lewes Arms, the name of the pub, etched into the glass. Camera's listing actually says they believe that glass work there to be old. The first bar room that you see as you enter is referred to by camera's listing as the Snug, and that's the one I think that has the most character. It's pretty tiny actually. There are just a few stalls along the bar counter, and then there is bench seating lining that curved window there. It's only because I've come here on the dot of midday, very rare to see it empty. And then moving through, we have the back bar area, a little bit more spacious than that front bar, or Snug as camera's listing describes it, and that has some glazing over the bar counter there. Off to the left hand side as you enter, there is another room there, a bit larger perhaps than the other two bar spaces on the ground floor. There is a fireplace in there, probably Victorian, cast iron with some tiling. Upstairs there is a further room. There are some interesting posters on the walls about some of the fun events that take place here at the Lewes Arms. We'll get onto those in a moment. Then there is a piano in one corner. Also of note here, I think this was originally downstairs, is a toad in the hole table. We will come back to that a little bit later. The pub's history, is it now called Pubs Wiki website, suggests that there's been a pub here since around about the mid 18th century. The earliest written reference I could find for it was in a book, the Brighton and Lewes Guide, dated 1805. And the earliest newspaper mention I could find is from 1823. It's marked with a PH on a Ordnance Survey map from circa 1873. Note here nearby there is a malt house and also a brewery, and the pub sits more or less in between the two. And I suspect, based on this location, that for at least some of its history, the Lewes Arms probably operated as the brewery tap for that brewery. And it's fairly certain it was at least owned by that brewery, or at least one of the owners of the brewery for some period of history. That was referred to as either the Star Brewery or the Star Lane Brewery, and most of the buildings of that are still intact. Today it's used as a mixture of, I think there's a gallery there, some studio space. For at least some of its history, that Star Lane Brewery or Star Brewery was owned by Beard and Co, and they brewed there up until 1958. At that point in history, Beard and Co became effectively like a modern pubco, a pub chain. They continued to own and operate a number of pubs up until 1998, and they sold those on to Green King. Also worth making a quick note on that 1870s map of Brack Mount, immediately behind the Lewes Arms. That was possibly the original site of Lewes Castle, one of the first structures built there, going back to the Norman era. But at one time, that used to be used as a sort of extended beer garden for the pub. Today, there is at least still a small terrace that goes a little bit up that mount at the back of the pub. When Beard & Co ceased their brewing operations at that site close to the Lewes Arms in 1958, their beers were still brewed for them by Harvey's. There's a nice newspaper advert from 1980 to attest to that partnership. And that also lists some of both breweries' pubs at that time. You can clearly see the Lewes Arms mentioned among the pubs. There's some more history of the Beard Brewing Company in this article from 1986. Also on the same page and somewhat connected to that article is a list of archaic pub games. And I think it's these quirky old-fashioned pub games which is one of the things that today the Lewes Arms is most famous for. They mention in this article Dwile clonking, which I suspect is probably either a typo or an alternative spelling for Dwile flonking or Dwile flunking. We'll come back to that in a moment. Also, the game Toad in the Hole is mentioned there, with a mention that it possibly originated in Lewes. And there is that table here in the pub still today for Toad in the Hole. I think it more or less involves sort of trying to toss a coin into that hole in that sloping table. Other quirky old-fashioned pub games mentioned there include Conga Cuddling, which involves throwing an eel at lifeboat crew. I think that originates in Lyme Regis. Also, Dadlums caught my eye. That is a Kentish version of Skittles, where instead of the usual ball to knock the Skittles down, I believe you employ what's called a cheese, which disappointingly is a disc of wood. Dwile flunking or Dwile flonking is still a regular fixture here. There is a wonderful British Paddy video showing Dwile flunking. Essentially, it involves putting a rag in a bucket of beer, that's called the Dwile, and then attempting to fling it at the ring of dancers who are dancing around the person in the middle. That's called flunking it or flonking it. Originates in East Anglia, but seems to have been taken up with some enthusiasm down here in Sussex. More recently, they have added some, I believe probably unique to the Lewes Arms, quirky games here, including spaniel racing, and also the World Pea Throwing Championships are held here, with the slightly tenuous justification for calling it the World Pea Throwing Championships that once somebody from Germany came to attend. One final claim to fame in more recent years for the Lewes Arms, and this has its own Wikipedia page, fantastically, is the Lewes Arms controversy. This was from the end of 2006 running into 2007. During the era that Greene King owned the pub, in their infinite wisdom, they decided to remove Harvey's Sussex Best Bitter from the regular bar lineup. There was outcry and dismay, and in fact the locals at the pub set up a boycott that lasted for 133 days. I believe there was even effectively a picket line outside the pub. Eventually Greene King relented and allowed them to put it back on the bar. There is something magic about this place, hard to put my finger on it. I don't know if it's the quirkiness, the sort of personification of we won't be druv, that Sussex motto of fierce independence that they have here in Sussex, and particularly here in Lewes. You're not going to change our beer. Like, we're going to do things the way we want to do them, and long may it remain the same. Cheers from the rights of man. I think this pub was rebuilt in its current form in the 1930s, and at least the frontage looks largely neo-Georgian to me. Reminds me of some of those interwar pubs we've seen in London. The interior has likely been modernised once or twice since then, but it does have some quite appealing booths along one side. It's all generally quite woody, even if perhaps some of that woodwork isn't hugely old. The chap behind the bar was telling me that it had a former use as a print works. So on the ceiling, as you come in, you can see some examples of some of the printing that had been done on this site prior to its use as a pub. There's also a, I think, really cute pottery rendition of Thomas Paine, after whose work the pub is named, up above the bar there, slightly reminiscent of a Toby jug. There is quite a nice roof terrace up at the back. I believe there has been a pub on this site, at least going back into the 19th century. It was earlier called the Rainbow, and the name Rights of Man is only about a decade old. You can see the pub on this roughly 1873 map marked with a PH. One thing that caught my eye on this map was an alleyway behind it named Pope's Entry, and that's perhaps some reference to this long-running enmity that Lewes has with the Pontiff. I think this is a good place to talk about one of Lewes's big claims to fame, This was the one-time residence of Thomas Paine, who was a very important figure in the American Revolution leading up to American independence. He lived here from 1768 to 1774. After that, a brief stint in London, after which he then emigrated to America. While he was here in Lewes, he lived in a 15th century house that today is called Bull House. It looks like it may have been a one-time pub to me. I think during the era that Thomas Paine was living there, it was a tobacconist. He held regular meetings at the White Hart, which is just across the street, more of a hotel today, currently closed for refurbishment work, so alas we can't go in, but that does bear a plaque. He held these meetings called the Headstrong Club, and it was at these that he discussed political ideas that probably then grew into his later writings, including most famously the book The Rights of Man, after which this pub is named. He also wrote some very influential pamphlets. I believe they're described as one called Common Sense and the other one called The American Crisis, and they were widely read during that time of change in America that ran up to its independence. As it happens, I'm filming here on July the 4th, Independence Day, so with slight reservations as an Englishman, congratulations to our any American viewers. There is this strong running theme in Sussex in general, and particularly here in Lewes, of independence and rejection of authority. And we see that manifest itself in various ways. Of course, famously with the Lewes bonfire. It's hard to imagine in any other town festivities of that sort allowing to be continued. Not just the sort of political and or religious sensibilities of the fact that they burn an effigy of the Pope every year, but also the health and safety side of it. I was there last year and it's absolutely fantastic, and I'm so happy that that sort of thing still continues today. But I think this fierce independence, this motto of Sussex, we won't be druv, that extends to these ideas of political independence, political freedom, and I think that very much played into Thomas Paine's writing, and as I say, that led up to the American Revolution and American independence. This is a Harvey's Tide house, and they had a range of no fewer than 4 different beers from Harvey's on the hand pumps. I thought for a change I would go for Sisters, which is a sort of a lighter version of Harvey's Sussex Best, slightly lower ABV, slightly paler colour, but definitely not a pale ale in that sense. Really nice actually, refreshing summery version of Harvey's Sussex Best. Look at that thing of absolute beauty behind me. Even with scaffolding on, they're obviously undergoing some repairs. It is an absolutely delightful sight. The Harvey's Brewery, pub number 3, the John Harvey Tavern. Cheers from the John Harvey Tavern. This is the Harvey's Brewery tap. It is located just across the High Street, Cliff High Street, I think this is called here, in a little alleyway called Bear Yard. It's on the former site of the Bear Inn, or the Bear Hotel, which was at least this part of Lewis's sort of most major inn up until 1918 when it burned down. Apparently this building here was one of the stable blocks. The building may have been here long before its current use as a pub. It's predominantly brick, but it has this beautiful flint dressing, which for me is very redolent. That doesn't sound too fancy a word, of Sussex architecture. Inside, it gives an impression of a much older pub than it really is. It has beams overhead. There's I think a really nice use of a giant, presumably something like a sherry butt, given the size, that's been split into 2 halves and made into seating inside. There is a flagstone floor, and at least some of the beers served directly from the barrels behind the bar. So I think today just the Harvey's Sussex Best was being served directly from the barrel, but sometimes some of their other beers are. I once again went for Sisters, because I quite enjoyed that at the last place. Slightly regret that I didn't go for the Harvey Sussex Best here, because of course it would have been served straight from the barrel, but anyway, this is really enjoyable. So I don't think this is a particularly old pub in its own right. I couldn't find any records of it as the John Harvey Tavern before about 2004, so I don't think it goes much back beyond the 21st century. I think Harvey's had possibly used this site as their offices for some time before converting it into their brewery tap. Interestingly, for a while, Harvey's Brewery was actually located over this side of the street in Bear Yard. By about 1820, John Harvey, the founder of the Harvey's Brewery dynasty was brewing here in Bear Yard and then later moved across the street in 1838 to what was then called the Bridge Wharf Brewery. The business, Harvey's, had origins slightly earlier than that as a beer, wine and spirit merchant going back to the 1790s. That's a date you sometimes see in some of their branding. Today the brewery shop over the road still has a very good range of products other than their own beer. They sell wines, spirits, including a really good range, I think, of local English wines and also stuff like Burgundy if you happen to be interested in that kind of thing. I include this pub here more because it's an opportunity to pay homage to the brewery across the street rather than the pub itself. I do think it's a decent pub in its own right, pleasingly woody inside, and I think this is rather an attractive building, even if its use as a pub is probably only 3 decades or so. Pub number 4, the Gardener's Arms. Cheers from the Gardener's Arms. Let's take a look at the exterior first. It is a brick building. On one side, I think this is called Foundry Lane. It has brick tiling from the first floor up. There is a shallow bay window, that frontage onto the main street, onto High Street, or is it called Cliff High Street here. It is actually a listed building. The building likely dates to the early to mid 19th century. And the earliest records that I could find of its use as a pub are from around about 1870, including here the 1871 census. You can see that the occupation of the head of household, I think that says innkeeper actually. I find this handwriting really hard to read. There's possibly even a note under the address that it's something like does that say beer shop? I can't read it. Just a couple of years later, on the Ordnance Survey map of 1873 or thereabouts, it does not appear to be marked with a PH for public house, but we've seen this many times before in videos for pubs that were formerly beer houses. They didn't get the same recognition. Inside, I don't know how old any of the fixtures and fittings are, but it does feel very, very pubby. And they also have another toad-in-the-hole table. It feels instantly familiar. This is actually my first time to come into the Gardener's Arms. All of the other pubs on today's tour I have been to before on previous visits to Lewes. Somehow I had overlooked the Gardener's Arms. It has won many awards from CAMRA over the years, and there are certificates on the wall to attest to that. CAMRA's What Pub site describes it as a genuine free house. I thought I should include this on today's itinerary, lest you start to think that the whole thing is essentially an advert for Harvey's. I should clarify, I'm absolutely not sponsored in any way. I have no business relationship with Harvey's. I just bloody love their beer. So if you happen to find yourself in Lewes and similarly are doing a tour of a number of pubs and eventually find you want something other than Harvey's, then this is very much a good place to come. Personally, I found the beer lineup a little bit kind of modern and hip leaning and a bit sort of, if not grapefruity, or at least grapefruit adjacent. Beautiful badge on there, Harvey's Sussex Best, quite an old fashioned little blue badge. I have no intention to drink anything else, to be honest, while I'm here in Lewes. Why would I? Pub number 5, the Snowdrop Inn. Cheers from the Snowdrop Inn. Don't have a huge amount to say here about the exterior. I'm guessing this is roughly a mid-19th century building. The sign actually says that it was established in 1840, and yeah, I guess I could just about believe that this building dates from that sort of era. The interior is quite interesting here. It's kind of a quirky, eclectic sort of an interior. There is a running canal barge kind of theme to it. The style of painting that you would typically see on a canal barge has obviously been a bit inspired by that. And in one corner are Rosie and Jim. I believe that was a kids' TV program in possibly the 1990s, I don't really recall. Interesting, quirky knickknacks around. There seems to be a cog theme as well. I don't know if that's a sort of reference to steampunk, I don't know. And water features, interestingly, inside the pub. The beer offering is kind of a bit more modern and or international and a bit more eclectic. Amongst all of the other taps and so forth that I saw, there was, of course, more Harvey's Sussex Best. I assume it's practically a legal requirement in Lewes. The name Snowdrop is, of course, initially misleading. You might think it would be named perhaps after the flower, but it actually refers to the Lewes avalanche of 1836. This is still to date the most deadly avalanche in the history of the United Kingdom. 15 people, I believe, were affected and 8 of them died. This area of Lewes is called Cliff. We're sort of a little bit out on the limb. We're right on the edge of Lewes. And I assume the name comes from the fact that immediately above us we have a spur of the South Downs. And you can see these very pronounced white chalky cliffs immediately above the houses here. In the winter of 1836, there was a particularly severe and sustained snowfall that built up on the cliffs up above the houses here, and rather tragically then at some point there was an avalanche. There are many newspaper accounts of the day attesting to that. A slightly later account from 1852 in a book titled The Handbook for Lewes, or A Handbook for Lewes, which seems to suggest that they thought at that time it was perhaps a bit distasteful to remember that tragic accident in this way by naming a pub after it. They said it was somewhat profanely, we think, denominated the Snowdrop. Interestingly, the earliest newspaper mention I was able to find for this pub is of a slightly less tragic incident, an incident that certainly could have ended tragically. However, a lady who had thrown herself into the river, the Ouse here, was saved by her crinoline dress. Apparently had some presumably buoyancy properties. You can see the pub marked on the 1873 thereabouts Ordnance Survey map with a PH. I think today it certainly has this sort of, I don't know, is bohemian the right word? I don't know. It has this sort of quite quirky, quite unusual atmosphere here on the outskirts of Lewes. Okay, well that is going to be it for today from Lewes. I know I've probably only really scratched the surface, and anyone who knows the town well will likely have numerous pubs that I have omitted they want to list down in the comments, but I've at least been to some of my favourites here in Lewes. I think it's a beautiful town. It has so much going for it. Fantastic beer, the great pubs, the great community, the great history, surrounded by spectacular countryside, all these wonderful buildings like Lewes Castle just behind me. Anyway, I feel like I've done my bit there for the Lewes Tourism Board. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.